A 4-year-old boy buried his parents beneath a tree, and no one helped him. This is the story of Mace Windu, the Jedi who walked into war before he ever left home. He wasn't born into peace, he was born into survival. Harun Kals wasn't a planet, it was a warning, covered in jungle so thick light barely touched the ground, trees that bled, creatures that listened, air that moved like it was watching. To grow up there wasn't to live, it was to resist being erased. His people, the Corran, lived on the edge of ancient pain. They fought because they had always fought. Each tribe had their enemies, each generation had their losses, and among them, Mace was different before anyone could name why. When he was a child, things broke around him that no one touched. Bones, branches, silence. Sometimes the ground itself trembled when he screamed. The elders whispered that he had shadows in his blood, that his eyes didn't see like others, but it wasn't fear they showed him, it was distance. Even his own family knew there was something beneath his skin that didn't belong to the jungle. His first memories weren't of play, they were of death. He watched people die with his name still in their mouths. Fire devoured huts. Smoke swallowed the trees, and by the time he was 5, he was alone. No one came for him. The Jedi didn't send a shuttle, no beacon was activated, no signal was traced. The galaxy didn't notice, so he learned to survive the only way Harun Kal allowed. He tracked wild beasts through the mist, slept under leaves that could kill with a single sting, ate only when the jungle allowed it. But the Force did not abandon him. It stirred at the edge of his senses like an old breath returning. He couldn't name it, but it moved through him like instinct sharpened into will. It warned him before the predators struck. It told him when to run, when to wait, when to strike. At 6 years old, he crafted a weapon, not a blade, a signal. He began carving shapes into stone, spirals, circles, lines that had no teacher. He climbed to the highest cliff in the Corran Highlands and stacked those stones where the wind never stopped. And for 3 days he waited. No food, no water, just silence. On the 4th day, the sky opened. It wasn't the roar of engines that woke him. It was the sound of calm, a sound he hadn't heard in years. A Republic ship landed in the clearing, and when the ramp opened, 3 Jedi stood at the base, 1 older, 2 younger, all quiet, all watching. They didn't need to ask his name, they could feel it. One held out a hand, but Mace didn't take it. He stepped forward on his own, never looking away. And then he spoke the first words he'd said to anyone in over a year. Why did it take so long? They didn't stat answer, they didn't stat answer. Because even then they understood, this wasn't a rescue, this was a reckoning. The Jedi didn't know what to make of him. Most children arrived at the temple with wide eyes and open hearts. Mace arrived with silence. He didn't ask questions, he didn't play, he didn't cry when they took his belongings away, or when they changed his name, or when they told him he'd never see Harun Kal again. He listened, he watched, and he remembered. The Masters said he was strong in the Force, stronger than anyone they'd brought in that cycle, but strength wasn't the issue, it was clarity. Mace didn't just feel the Force, he saw it move before it moved. He could tell which initiates would succeed, which masters were lying, which friendships wouldn't last. He said things no child should have known. He pointed at one instructor and asked how long they'd been afraid of dying. He told another they shouldn't have hidden the lightsaber crystal in the floorboards. He walked past Yoda once and said nothing, but the old Grand Master looked back with more focus than usual. It wasn't disrespect, it was perception. And perception made people nervous. By the time he reached adolescence, Mace was no longer just a gifted student. He was an anomaly. The other younglings gave him space. Some thought he was cold, others thought he could hear their thoughts. In truth, he didn't need to. Their fears spoke louder than their words. He could feel the cracks in their voices, the anxiety behind every boast, the shame behind every act of defiance. The masters met in private more than once to decide how to handle him. His control was perfect, his discipline beyond reproach, but something was missing. They said he lacked warmth. They said he understood the code, but not compassion. They said he might never pass the trials. But Mace wasn't waiting for permission. He was studying them the same way they studied him. He spent his nights in the archives, reading texts others ignored, obscure scrolls on Jedi lost to history, commentaries on unorthodox lightsaber forms, accounts of visions that never made it into official reports. He wasn't looking for secrets, he was looking for patterns. That tests when he began having the dreams. Not of power, not of fear, but of a battlefield where no one was left standing, and always in the center was him. He spoke to no one about them, but his meditation changed. His connection to the Force grew sharper, thinner, like a blade honed to the point of danger. At 14, he built his lightsaber, alone, without a master, without guidance. Most students constructed green or blue blades, symbols of harmony or defense. Mace didn't. His crystal sang a different note. When the saber ignited, it glowed purple. The council asked why. He said only this: "The Force showed me its edge." They didn't like that answer, but they couldn't deny what they saw. His technique was flawless, his instincts perfect, but his presence was heavy. Even when calm, it felt like a storm waiting behind glass. Mace Windu wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying not to break them. The Order made their decision. He would be trained. But the choice was never truly theirs. The Force had already made it. Mace Windu didn't just learn the forms, he dissected them. As a Padawan, he trained under Master Sislin Moore, a Jedi Knight who believed in listening more than instructing. She sensed early what others missed, that Mace wasn't looking for power. He was trying to control something already inside him, something too sharp to hold with bare hands. His early sparring matches were fast but distant. He never struck to win. He struck to prevent loss. Even when cornered, he never panicked. He simply waited for the weakness to reveal itself, and it always did. Mace didn't fight with emotion, but he fought like someone who had buried people. While others relied on acrobatics, Mace relied on stillness. He didn't leap unless it was necessary. He didn't shout. He didn't smile when he landed a blow. He moved like someone who had already decided what the ending would be, and had accepted it long before it arrived. There was one moment that defined his Padawan years. A rogue Force sensitive on Iridonia had escaped capture. 3 Jedi had tried to bring him in. 2 died. The last was missing. The Council sent Sislin. She brought Mace. It wasn't a test. It was a necessity. No other knight was available. They tracked the fugitive through burned villages and ravaged temple ruins. The trail ended in a collapsed monastery buried in ash. Inside, they found the missing Jedi, barely alive, and next to her a man crouched with blood on his hands and no light in his eyes. Colslin approached first. She spoke with calm. She offered peace. The man laughed and ignited his blade. Mace stepped in front of her before the fight began. He said nothing. They clashed for 17 seconds. When it was over, the fugitive lay disarmed and unconscious. Mace hadn't killed him. He had disarmed him with such precision. The blade's hilt split in 2 before the man even realized. Later, the healers said his opponent would recover. Colslin said nothing at first, but when they returned to Coruscant, she made her report clear. He doesn't need to be trained anymore. He needs to be trusted. The Council disagreed. Not with her assessment, but with her conclusion. Because by now, they understood what he was creating. Varped hadn't yet been named, but its shape was forming. A lightsaber form that would touch the edge of darkness without falling in. A method of channeling aggression without submission. No one else could have made it. No one else would have dared. Mace wasn't inventing a style. He was inventing a leash for himself. And only he could hold it. He studied Form 7 in secret. He experimented with movements no master had approved. He meditated over pain, not to banish it, but to understand its rhythm. He wasn't chasing the dark side. He was building a wall against it, one strike at a time. But walls don't last forever. There were moments when his blade moved faster than thought, when his vision narrowed to the beating heart of his opponent, when he heard the Force scream in his ears, not with warning, but with hunger. Each time he pulled back. Each time he stepped away from the cliff. But the cliff remembered. The Council never agreed on him. Some saw him as a prodigy, others as a threat, but no one saw him as ordinary. By the time Mace Windu was 23, he had already completed missions that would have broken seasoned knights. Negotiations with warlords on Raxus Prime, extraction of hostages from pirate strongholds in the Outer Rim, interventions on Force-sensitive breakouts deep within Hutt space. He moved through them all with the same silent purpose, to end the conflict before it grew. He didn't revel in victory, he didn't celebrate peace, he simply moved to the next task. Behind closed doors, the High Council debated. He was too young, too sharp, too confident, and yet the galaxy kept confirming what they were trying to ignore. Mace Windu wasn't set waiting to be made a master. He was already acting like one, and the Force refused to be quiet about it. He began sensing things others couldn't set, moments in people set's lives where things would break, a hesitation before betrayal, a shift before death, a silence before disaster. The Temple called it rare precognition, Mace called it something else. A shatterpoint. He couldn't explain it. He could only feel it, invisible threads between people, places, events, all converging toward a single moment when everything could change. Sometimes he spoke of it in council meetings, sometimes he didn't, but those who heard him began to understand that he wasn't seeing the future, he was seeing the weakness in fate itself. And the more he saw, the more alone he became. He wasn't ostracized, he was respected, admired, even feared, but rarely understood. Mace was given a seat on the High Council by the time he was 30, younger than any member since the days of the Old Republic. His voice was quiet but final. His judgments carried weight, not because of arrogance, but because of accuracy. When he spoke, the others listened, even when they disagreed. Especially when they disagreed. Some whispered that he was becoming the will of the Council, that he was what the Jedi needed to be in an era of rising shadows. Others wondered if the weight he carried would become too much for any one man. Mace heard all of it, and he ignored it, not out of pride, but discipline. He still meditated daily, still trained before dawn, still walked the temple halls like a ghost wrapped in cloth and silence. He kept no attachments, he gave no promises, he sought no legacy, but he did ask questions. Why were the Jedi becoming diplomats more than guardians? Why was the Senate gaining influence over Jedi assignments? Why were they spreading themselves thin across a galaxy that no longer understood them? He asked these questions in private, never in anger, but the Force never answered. So he answered for it. He doubled his training, took on more missions, studied older records of Jedi who had walked too close to darkness and never returned, and he built his philosophy not on hope but on control. Control of self, control of fear, control of conflict before it began. He believed that emotion clouded clarity, that attachment broke judgment, that even compassion, if given at the wrong time, could become a weapon in someone else's hand. And so the boy from Haruan Kal, the one who waited in a jungle while the galaxy forgot him, became the voice the galaxy now feared to ignore. The Force had called him, but it had done more than that. It had shaped him into its response. Chapter 2. The Blade Without Balance. Most Jedi found their crystals. Mace Windu found him. The temple sent him to Hurricane, a world of jagged rock and violet storms, barely habitable and long forgotten. The journey wasn't ceremonial, it was necessary. His connection to the Force had grown louder, more chaotic. The Masters hoped time alone, away from Coruscant's influence, might bring clarity. But clarity wasn't set what the Force gave him. He wandered for days, tracing the windswept cliffs without guidance. He didn't meditate, he didn't speak, he just walked. The Force pulled him forward, steady and constant, like gravity that ignored everything else, and then it stopped. At the edge of a canyon shaped like a wound. He didn't hesitate. He climbed down without gear, using his hands, his will, and the silence that had followed him since birth. The canyon floor was cold and filled with shards, broken pieces of crystal that hummed faintly underfoot. And then he saw it. Not glowing, not waiting, buried deep in the wall like a buried heart still beating, a kyber crystal. But this one wasn't green, or blue, or even white. It was purple. The moment his hand touched the stone, the Force flared, not bright, but violent. He collapsed to his knees, gritting his teeth, his vision swallowed by a storm that wasn't there. He saw fire. He saw himself on a battlefield. He saw a figure in shadow raising a red blade, not at him, but beside him. And then it stopped. He opened his eyes, the crystal pulsed once, then went silent. He didn't tell anyone what he saw. He only returned with the stone. When he presented it, the council waited. Some expected green, others blue, the colors of harmony, the colors of balance. Instead, when he ignited his saber, the blade sang violet. Unnatural, unapproved, unwelcome. It was the first purple lightsaber the Jedi had seen in generations. They asked him how, why, what it meant. Mace said only this: "It didn't come to me in peace." He didn't elaborate, he didn't smile. He held the saber like someone holds a secret they wish they didn't have to keep. The whispers began again. Some said it was a bad omen, that the blade mirrored the conflict within, that no Padawan should carry such a color. Others argued it didn't matter, the crystal had chosen him, and the Force had made its decision. But none of them understood what he understood. That his blade wasn't an expression of mastery, it was a reflection of restraint. The color wasn't set permission, it was a warning. Because from that moment on, Mace Windu was never seen as a student again, not truly. His presence shifted. The younger Jedi gave him space. The knights offered polite distance, and the masters watched. He trained harder than anyone, meditated longer, practiced until the skin on his palms broke. He wasn't trying to improve, he was trying to contain. Because deep inside him, beneath the discipline, beneath the robes, beneath the calm, was something old and sharp and waiting. And only he could keep it quiet. Most Jedi built their sabers as a rite of passage. Mace Windu built his like a man preparing for war. He didn't ask for help. He didn't want instruction. He returned from Hurricane with the crystal, but not with answers. The Force had shown him a glimpse of what could be, not what should be, and that uncertainty became his burden. In the temple's forge chambers, he worked alone. Nights passed without rest. He adjusted the hilt more than a dozen times, not for style or comfort, but for control. The weight had to feel wrong in others' hands. It had to feel right only in his. It wasn't a weapon of elegance, it was a line in the sand. The final design didn't follow the traditions. No ornate embellishments, no curved grip. The emitter was sharp, stark, like a blade meant to pierce, not dance. And when he lit it for the first time, it hummed differently, deeper, slower, almost unwilling. It didn't denounce itself, it warned. When the masters reviewed his construction, some raised concerns. The balance was too aggressive, the grip too rigid, the power cycling too tight. He stood silently while they critiqued it, and when they finished, he deactivated the blade and spoke only once. "It won that fail, even if I do." They said nothing after that. Mace carried it differently, not at his hip, but across his back, diagonally, like a warrior from a world the Jedi had tried to forget. It wasn't symbolic, it was practical. His blade was not for ceremony, it was for when diplomacy failed, and silence was no longer enough. But he didn't store it often. That's what made them nervous. There were Padawans who ignited their sabers in training halls just to test color and angle. Mace didn't. Weeks passed, then months. He sparred without activating his own blade. He trained without revealing his form. He wasn't set hiding. He was waiting. When he finally did fight, it was brief, controlled, devastating. One of the temple's elite instructors volunteered to test him, expecting a learning opportunity. The bout lasted less than 20 seconds. The instructor was disarmed without being touched. Mace had predicted every movement before it happened. He bowed, offered no satisfaction, then walked away before anyone could speak. The legend began to grow, not because of what he said, but because of what he refused to. They said his saber was more precise than Dooku's, more forceful than Pulse Kun's, more deliberate than Ki-Adi-Mundi's, but it was none of those things. It was something else. Something built to end things before they began. But even Mace feared it. Not because of what it could do, but because of what it required him to become when he used it. Every swing demanded perfect control. Every parry flirted with finality. Every movement was a chance to go too far, and there was no safety net beneath it. That was the difference. Most Jedi trained to defend, Mace trained to hold himself back. Because he understood more than anyone else in the Order what he was capable of if he didn't. And so the blade stayed sheathed, not out of mercy, but out of discipline. There was a reason Form 7 had been forbidden. It didn't ask for balance, it demanded aggression, not the wild rage of the Sith, but something colder, more focused. It took the edge of fury and shaped it into purpose, but it left no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. The Order had buried it centuries ago. Too many Jedi had been lost chasing perfection through combat. Too many fell into the darkness without knowing it. But Mace Windu read what others avoided, and in those pages he found a mirror. He didn't study Form 7 to win duels, he studied it to survive himself. The movement patterns were wild, erratic, surging forward like a storm, then vanishing into stillness. Timing was everything, and so was surrender, not to emotion but to instinct. Controlled instinct, cold fire. A precise burn that could melt steel if held too long. At first he practiced in secret, not because he feared punishment, but because he feared success. The Force felt different when he moved that way. Not wrong, just honest. Too honest. It showed him what he could be if he stopped holding back. A blade without a hilt. A wave without a shore. A weapon without mercy. Varpad began as a variation, a correction, a boundary, but boundaries don't hold unless someone does. Mace made himself that wall. He refined the style, not with flair, but with restraint. Every strike had a cost. Every counter required intention. Varpad didn't just turn offense into defense, it turned darkness into reflection. When facing an opponent who channeled the dark side, Mace could feel their hatred, not absorb it, not reject it, but return it, amplified, redirected, broken. But it only worked if his mind stayed clear. If even one thought slipped, Varpad would no longer be a bridge, it would be a blade drawn inward. Only 2 others ever tried to learn it from him. One failed, one vanished. He never taught it again. There were times during training when observers noted something unnatural in the room, a shift in temperature, a pressure in the air, like lightning waiting for permission. It wasn't the saber, it was him. The Force bent around Varpard, not in fear, but in warning. And so the Council gave him no recognition, no reward. They acknowledged the form existed. They allowed him to use it, but they never encouraged others to follow. Because they understood what he had built. Varpard wasn't set a fighting style. It was containment, a breathing cage made of motion and silence. Mace never used it unless he had to, but when he did, it ended things quickly. No wasted movement, no theatrical flair, just absolute finality. And when the dust settled, he always stood still for a long moment, as if listening, not to the Force, but to whatever part of himself had just gone quiet again. Mace Windu never called himself a master of Varpard, because mastering something means you stop fearing it, and he never did. The Jedi around him began to rise through the ranks with their own titles, missions, and philosophies, but Mace stayed focused on the same thing: control, not of others, not of the galaxy, of himself. He didn't seek to reshape the Jedi Code. He didn't question the Council's authority, but he carried a weight that no one else saw, a responsibility that had nothing to do with leadership and everything to do with prevention. The more he trained, the more he realized how thin the line was, not between Jedi and Sith, but between awareness and attachment, between decisive action and cruelty disguised as justice. So he crafted a personal code beneath the one all Jedi followed. No emotion in the act, no pleasure in the result, no judgment in the kill, only necessity, only silence. He kept this to himself, not because he feared rejection, but because he knew most Jedi couldn't walk that edge without falling. They needed faith. He relied on structure. They trusted the Force to guide them. He trusted it to test him. Peace, for Mace Windu, was not a feeling. It was the moment right before conflict, the breath before the strike, the thought before the word, and he lived inside that space every day. When asked by younger Padawans why he trained so often, even as a council member, he always gave the same answer: because I said not finished yet. It wasn't set humility, it was maintenance. Because Varpard didn't sleep, it waited, and the more power he gained, in title, in reputation, in clarity, the more dangerous it became. He rarely accepted praise. He never allowed applause. When others saluted him in the field, he nodded and turned away. The work wasn't for legacy, it was survival. The purple blade he carried became a symbol across the galaxy, whispered about by separatists, feared by warlords, respected by clones who saw him fight without speaking. But Mace didn't carry it for symbolism. He carried it because it reminded him of everything he wasn't allowed to become. The saber's color marked him as different. The Council called it unique, some called it rare, but for Mace it was a scar. A reminder that he had seen something at the edge of the Force no one else had, and that he had chosen to walk back. Years passed. The temple changed. The Senate began interfering more openly. Assignments became political. Morality became complicated. But Mace never wavered. He made decisions others couldn't, sacrificed opportunities others cherished, and when he spoke in the council chamber, his words carried the weight of someone who had already paid the price. Control wasn't set power. Control was cost. And he paid it every time he held back, every time he stepped into a room and chose not to draw the saber, even when he wanted to. Every time he saw a future he couldn't allow, and still waited for the moment to be sure. The galaxy would come to know him as the warrior without fear. But fear had never been his enemy. Loss was loss of self, loss of clarity, loss of what made a Jedi different from the thing they swore to destroy. And so while others searched for peace in the stars, Mace Windu found his in the only place it ever truly existed, inside the choice not to strike. Chapter 3, Varpard, the Dance with Darkness. The Jedi believed in limits. Every form had a boundary. Every power had a cost. Even the greatest masters taught that balance was not about strength, but knowing when to stop. But Mace Windu had spent his life walking the edge of things, and now he was standing in front of something the Jedi refused to name. Form 7 had been buried long before he was born, not because it was incomplete, but because it was too complete, too efficient, too aggressive. It worked, but it worked in ways that left Jedi changed, detached, hollow. Some called it Juyo. The ancient texts spoke of it as a path that demanded fury, not just the ability to feel it, but the willingness to let it pass through. That was what made it dangerous. That's what made it necessary. Because Mace had begun to see a different kind of darkness spreading, not the kind that shouted, the kind that whispered, the kind that didn't announce itself with red sabers and cloaks, but with smiles in the Senate and silence in the Force. The Jedi were fighting shadows with diplomacy. But Mace had always seen the fracture points before they formed. He wasn't seeking power. He wasn't chasing perfection. He was preparing for something he couldn't yet name, a coming storm that the Council felt but wouldn't face. And in his meditations, one thing became clear. The old forms wouldn't be enough. Form I through VS relied on balance, defense, philosophy. Even Dooku's Makashi, elegant and refined, assumed that a duel would be fair, that the enemy would follow a rhythm. But the Sith didn't follow rhythm, they broke it. Mace began studying Juyo alone. He didn't tell the Council, not because he feared punishment, but because he feared they'd misunderstand. They would think he was testing it, experimenting, trying to revive a lost form. But he wasn't reviving anything. He was resisting something. Every motion of Juyo felt like an invitation. The way the strikes flowed together, the absence of hesitation, the way the Force surged when control was loosened, even for a moment, it was intoxicating, not in a way that seduced, but in a way that felt inevitable, like gravity. He realized quickly that he couldn't use Juyo as it was, not and stay whole. So he changed it. Not the moves, the mindset. He stripped the form of its surrender, rebuilt it around intention. Mace didn't fight through anger. He fought through clarity. His strikes weren't powered by hate. They were powered by discipline, so sharp it looked like rage from a distance. That's what Vapat became. A dance with darkness, but on his own terms. He didn't just channel his own emotions, he learned to reflect others. When fighting a dark side user, he could feel their fury pushing against him. Instead of resisting it, he let it pass through him, let it move his blade, sharpen his reactions, fuel his counters, but never take root. It wasn't control over them, it was control over himself. But it wasn't perfect. Because there were moments, short ones but real, when he didn't know if it was still him behind the strikes. When the line between reflection and absorption blurred, when the clarity faded for just a breath, and something colder filled its place. Each time he stepped back, resented, remembered. But the memory lingered. The Council never asked. They saw his precision, his restraint, his loyalty. They assumed his power came from training, from discipline, from his unshakable belief in the code. But that wasn't true. His power came from something the code didn't account for. The ability to stand at the very edge of corruption and not fall in. And the Jedi feared that edge, because most of them had never seen it up close. Mace Windu lived there. Every Jedi had limits. Vapat was built to test them. Mace Windu didn't design the form for students. He never wrote it down, never codified it. It wasn't something to be taught, it had to be survived. The movements were violent, but clean, elegant but brutal. Each step forward was a challenge to the body, each rotation of the blade, a challenge to the mind. Because Vapat didn't ask for power, it asked for surrender, but not the kind the Sith craved, not surrender to hate, surrender to instinct, controlled instinct. the part of the self that fought not for pride, but for survival. To use Vapad was to invite darkness into your rhythm, just enough to see its shape, then push it back out. But that wasn't set the hardest part. The hardest part was what it showed you. Vapad wasn't just about channeling the dark side. It was about mirroring it, letting your opponent's rage flow through you, reflect off of you, turn back on them. In battle, this felt like control, like balance, but in silence, it was something else. It made you remember what you were capable of. And once you remembered, you could never forget. Mace saw it during his solo missions, when he stood across from warlords who killed without flinching, when he disarmed assassins who never spoke, when he stopped a Force-sensitive slaver by breaking his will without breaking his body. He didn't use Vapad every time, but when he did, it changed the air around him. Witnesses said it felt like standing next to a storm that didn't know it had landed. Even his fellow Jedi sensed it. When he returned from certain assignments, his presence shifted. He spoke less, stared longer, spent more time in the meditation chambers, sitting so still it was unclear if he was breathing. Because Vapad left a mark. Not on the skin, on the silence. One night, Sora Bulk asked to learn it. He was strong, disciplined, trusted. Mace agreed. For a time, it worked. Bulk adapted quickly. His strikes were precise, his balance perfect, but something changed, slowly, quietly. His eyes began to follow people too long. His voice took on a different weight, less curious, more certain. In sparring sessions, he pressed harder than needed. In council debates, he no longer questioned outcomes, he expected them. Then he vanished. When he returned, he wasn't set the same. Sora Bulk had fallen to the dark side, and worse, he claimed Vapad had led him there. Mace didn't defend the form, he didn't argue, he didn't blame his student, he blamed himself. He never taught it again. Not fully, because Vapad wasn't just a lightsaber form, it was a reflection of the one who used it, and in the wrong hands, reflections become distortions. That sits what made it so dangerous. It didn't corrupt you. It revealed you. It asked one question, over and over. Can you keep yourself from yourself? Mace never stopped asking, never stopped watching, and he never stopped wondering when the reflection would push back. There were times when even he questioned it. Not the form, not the training, himself. Because Vapad didn't just live in battle, it stayed with him after. It followed him into meditation, into sleep, into the quiet corridors of the Jedi Temple, long after the lights had dimmed. It waited in the silence, not calling to him, but reminding him what you are capable of, what you can become, what no one else would stop if you slipped. He never told the council. There was nothing to confess. He hadn't crossed the line, but he had seen it, closer than anyone ever should. It happened during missions where justice wasn't enough, where warlords smiled as they surrendered, where crime lords offered bribes instead of resistance, where corruption wore robes and mercy meant watching it spread. He held the blade steady. He said the right words, but inside there were moments, brief, sharp, when another version of him answered first. The one that didn't wait. The one that ended threats completely. The one that didn't leave room for them to return. And that was the version Vapad understood best. There was a mission on Nar Shaddaa that still echoed in his memory. A hostage situation. A smuggler syndicate had taken a senator's family. No demands, no negotiation. Just a statement: the Republic had no reach here. He entered the hideout alone. It took 45 seconds. When it was over, no one was dead. But every smuggler in that room refused to speak. Not out of fear, out of something deeper. They looked at him like he wasn't a Jedi, like he was something else. He had moved too fast, too precise, disarmed them all without a single wound. The Force had wrapped around him like armor, but heavier, tighter, and when he left, he felt it lingering, not pride, not anger, but something cold and still. He told himself it was restraint, but restraint shouldn't feel like exhaustion. That sets the cost the Jedi didn't talk about. Holding back every second, pulling your thoughts away from what's efficient and back toward what's right. Letting someone live not because they deserve it, but because you refuse to let their choices become your reflection. It wore him down, quietly, not as weakness, as weight. And that weight never left. He began spending more time alone, fewer words in council meetings, fewer visits to the archives. He trained harder, not to improve, but to remind himself that he still could, that his mind still followed his will, and not the shadow inside his form. Because one day he knew the line would blur again. And the person he became for just a second might not leave. He was praised for his control, his judgment, his discipline. But discipline isn't set peace. It sets pressure. And the longer you hold it, the louder the crack becomes. There was no ceremony for what he carried. No holocron recorded it, no student recited it, no Jedi Master stood beside him and said, "This is the price." But Mace Windu knew, because he paid it every day, not with blood, with silence. Vapad was never about defeating the Sith. That was the mistake others made when they looked at it, assuming it was a weapon designed for conquest. It wasn't. It was a mirror, a discipline, a defense against something far more dangerous than a red blade. Himself. Because the Jedi didn't fall all at once. They didn't wake up one morning and stop believing. They fell in small ways, in unseen moments, in compromises no one noticed, until it was too late. Mace didn't just want to stop the Sith. He wanted to stop the thing that made people become them. And to do that, he had to go where most Jedi wouldn't. Into the places in the Force where it stopped whispering and started watching. That sets what Vapad revealed. Not rage, not ambition, the feeling of standing at the edge of something eternal and understanding that you had to move without knowing which step would save you and which would end you. But he never moved blindly. That was his true strength. Not the power of the form, not the sharpness of his blade. It was that he knew exactly what he could become and chose not to. He studied the histories, the lost names, Jedi who danced too close to the dark, who told themselves they were in control until they weren't. Some had vanished, others were hunted, a few tried to return. None were the same. He never judged them, because he understood them. He knew how it felt to look at an enemy and see more than a threat, to see a lesson, an opportunity, a reason. He knew the temptation of finality, of justice that left no room for return. But he also knew something deeper, the cost of never turning back. So he practiced, not just his blade, his breath, his thoughts, his memories, every day, every night. When others slept, he listened. When others questioned, he waited, not out of indecision, but discipline. And that discipline wasn't set piece. It was pain. Not a pain anyone could see, not something to heal. It was the ache of standing still when every instinct told him to act. The ache of mercy in the face of certainty. The ache of knowing he could end something, but choosing instead to hold the line. Others called him cold. He wasn't stead. He was tired. Because the art of never falling is knowing you could, and living with that truth without running from it. The galaxy would come to call him many things: warrior, general, counselor. He would stand beside legends, speak in rooms where destinies were shaped, hold back chaos with only his voice. But Mace Windu was never trying to be remembered. He was trying not to become the thing everyone feared he might already be. And that sets why he never stopped, because the blade was always lit, even when it wasn't set. Chapter 4, Night of the Invisible War. There were missions no Jedi spoke of. Not because they failed, Because they succeeded too quietly. After the Battle of Naboo, the galaxy celebrated peace. The Sith were gone, they said. The Republic was stable, the Jedi had restored order, but Mace Windu knew better. He had stood in the room with Darth Maul's corpse, felt the tension in the Force when Palpatine looked too long at Anakin Skywalker, heard the silence between Senate votes. He knew what peace built on shadows felt like. And so, while the Jedi returned to their routines, opening temples, training younglings, mediating trade, Mace began taking assignments that were never formally recorded. He didn't wear robes, he didn't bring a Padawan, he didn't always bring a ship registered to the Order. These weren't missions of diplomacy. They were corrections. Out in the Mid-Rim, pirates were organizing, not scattered criminals, but something tighter, structured. He tracked them to a mining moon where shipments kept vanishing without reports. The local governor claimed nothing was wrong. Mace found 10 missing freighters buried beneath the surface, cut open and emptied. When he asked how this happened, no one answered. By morning, the pirate cell was gone. No lightsaber marks, no injuries, just silence, and a system that resumed operation without ever acknowledging it had stopped. That was the pattern. On Andeln Thorf, a Senator Sip's private army had begun arresting protesters. The Jedi were forbidden from intervening in domestic politics. Mace visited alone. By the end of the week, the army had disbanded. The senator had resigned, citing health reasons. He left without speaking to anyone. Even the council didn't always know the details. They trusted him because he never gave them reason not to. But trust like that comes with isolation. He couldn't explain what these missions took from him. They didn't require violence, not always. They required restraint sharpened into a weapon. The ability to say the right thing at the wrong time, to press someone just enough to make them choose collapse over resistance. He walked through systems where Jedi weren't welcome, sat in rooms with people who would have killed him if they knew who he was, listened to stories the Republic refused to hear, and he solved them without leaving footprints. Because the truth was, the galaxy didn't want justice. It wanted relief. It didn't care how the bleeding stopped, only that it did. Mace became the one who made that happen, quietly, completely, with a presence that felt like warning, even when he smiled. He was a Jedi Master. But in these moments, he was something else. Not an assassin, not a shadow, not a servant of the dark. He was the weight that kept everything from tipping over, and the longer he carried it, the heavier it became. The Republic called it peacekeeping. But peace doesn't come from open hands. It comes from hands that know when to close. Mace Windu understood this better than anyone. The Senate loved the Jedi for their image, guardians of light, impartial arbiters, symbols of serenity. But symbols didn't stop wars. Words didn't stop men who profited from chaos. Treaties didn't silence those who had already decided the Republic was too weak to punish them. So Mace used another language, the one people understood: certainty. On Ord Radama, a warlord had armed civilians with stolen droid armies. Entire villages vanished into forced labor camps. When the council debated intervention, the Senate argued jurisdiction. Mace didn't wait. He went alone. By the time the Republic sent inspectors, the warlord had surrendered, claiming illness. His army dismantled itself within a week. No one ever knew what Windu had said to him. No one asked. On Juma 9, a cartel had threatened to collapse an entire star lane unless the Republic legalized their trade. The Jedi sent a diplomatic envoy. The cartel laughed. Then Mace arrived. 3 days later, the cartel agreed to dissolve. Their fleets disappeared into scrapyards. Their leaders stepped down voluntarily. Diplomacy, the Senate called it. But it hadn't been diplomacy. It had been Mace, sitting in silence across from them, hands folded, voice steady, a presence so unyielding it felt like a blade against the throat. They folded not because he threatened them, but because they knew he didn't need to. The Order pretended these victories were political. The Senate pretended they were concessions. Only Mace knew the truth. They were warnings. Each of these encounters pulled him further from what Jedi were meant to be, but he accepted it. Not because he enjoyed it, not because he sought control, because he believed someone had to. Someone had to make the choices that didn't fit in the code. Someone had to carry the weight of what the Council refused to admit. Someone had to look power in the eye and not blink. And so he did. But there was a cost. When he returned to Coruscant, he trained harder, slept less. His meditations became longer, quieter, heavier. Younger Jedi tried to approach him, to ask questions, to learn from him. But he rarely spoke. He didn't want disciples. He didn't want anyone else to carry what he carried. Because what he was doing wasn't a lesson. It was survival, for the Republic, for the Jedi, for himself. The galaxy believed in the Council's wisdom, but what kept it steady wasn't their wisdom. It was his restraint. And restraint leaves scars. The Jedi didn't lie. That's what they told themselves. That's what the archives said. That's what the Padawans believed. But silence is a kind of lie. So is omission. And the Order had begun to live by both. Mace Windu understood this. He didn't embrace it. He endured it. Because as the cracks widened across the Republic, the Jedi needed something more than hope. They needed stability, even if it meant hiding what it took to keep the roof from caving in. The missions he took weren't recorded. The outcomes were presented as negotiations. The threats he neutralized were rebranded as de-escalations. And when young Jedi asked how, the Council offered answers that fit cleanly into the code, answers that left out everything that didn't. Not because they were afraid of truth, because they were afraid of what the truth would do to their image. The Jedi couldn't be seen as executioners, or enforcers, or shadows. They were peacekeepers, wisdom bearers, moral anchors in a chaotic galaxy. That was the story. That was the myth. And Mace was the one making sure the myth didn't fall apart. He didn't resent it, he accepted it. The way a dam accepts water, not because it wants to hold it, but because it has to. But he started to feel it in the way people looked at him. They didn't see a teacher or a leader. They saw something colder, sharper. The one who said what others wouldn't. The one who made decisions others were too noble to voice. The one who always voted last in council meetings, but whose vote always carried the room. Even his closest allies began to shift. Yoda trusted him, but watched him more closely. Ki-Adi-Mundi followed his lead, but with hesitation. Plo Koon asked fewer questions. Obi-Wan stayed silent around him. Anakin never truly trusted him. Mace noticed all of it. He kept going anyway. Because the Order needed a face that wouldn't blink, a voice that wouldn't tremble, a presence that reminded the Senate, the military, the galaxy, that Jedi still stood for something unmovable. But being unmovable meant not feeling, not wavering, not showing the damage. And he was damaged. He began seeing things in the Force he couldn't explain, visions of collapse, of battles fought in marble chambers, of Jedi blades clashing with one another, of fire falling through the temple ceiling. But he said nothing. The others saw echoes, he saw inevitability, and still he stayed quiet. Because the Jedi weren't ready to hear what the Force was screaming. So he told a different story, that the Order was strong, that the Republic still held. That peace could still be protected, even if he no longer believed it. Even if it cost him the last pieces of himself. There were names that never made it into the archives. People Mace Windu saved, people he silenced. Worlds that still spun because of what he didn't say. The Council never asked for details. They received his reports, redacted, shortened, cleaned. They nodded, approved, moved on. It wasn't set apathy. It was survival. The galaxy was unraveling slowly. The Republic still functioned, but just barely. Corruption filled the cracks between laws. Armies were being built behind diplomatic facades, and across the stars, darkness wore 1,000 disguises. The Council knew, but they didn't want to believe the collapse had already begun. So they let Mace carry it. He didn't just ask for help. He didn't just want sympathy. He just needed them to stay focused on the parts that still worked. Because what he had seen, in the Outer Rim, in the underworlds of Coruscant, in the halls of power where Sith whispers passed as policy, wasn't just decay. It was design. Something was moving beneath everything. Not loud, not direct, but patient, precise. And the more Mace tried to trace it, the more it slipped through. He began to understand that the Jedi weren't being tested by random events. They were being pulled into position, like pieces on a board they couldn't see. The Council debated endlessly on neutrality, on detachment, on how to maintain balance. But balance was already gone. Mace didn't say this out loud. He just pushed harder, took more missions, offered fewer explanations, let them believe he was cold because it was easier than the truth. He wasn't set cold. He was burning out. Not from guilt, from friction. Every time he told a young knight to stay calm when he knew they wouldn't survive the assignment. Every time he approved a mission, knowing the Senate would twist the outcome. Every time he stood in the council chamber and voted to preserve peace he knew no longer existed. He wasn't sit lying to them. He was lying for them. Because someone had to. And the more he did it, the less of him came back. He no longer walked the temple halls the way he used to, no longer lingered in the archives, no longer sparred with initiates. He became a shape in the corner of the council chamber, always present, always listening, always exact. His voice carried authority. But inside it was growing quieter. Because there comes a point when even the strongest silence starts to collapse. And Mace Windu was nearing that point. He had held back the tide, held together the Order, held his blade steady through 100 unseen wars. But something was coming. Something the Council would not see. Something the Senate would not stop. Something the Force no longer whispered about, but warned urgently. And when it came, Mace knew it wouldn't arrive with an army. It would arrive in a room, with a boy, with a question, with a choice. And when that moment came, he wouldn't still have time to ask for help. He would be alone. Like he had always been. Chapter 5, The Council and the Cage. The council chamber was always quiet. Even in disagreement, even in urgency, the voices that filled that circular room were calm, detached, reflective. 12 masters, each chosen for wisdom, for clarity, for balance. But over time, one voice rose above the rest, not with volume, not with emotion, with certainty. Mace Windu didn't speak often, but when he did, the conversation ended, not because he forced it, because he had already made the decision no one else was willing to face. He wasn't elected to lead. There was no official title, no command rank. Yoda still sat at the center, still carried the weight of tradition, but the rest of the Order began to orbit around Mace, slowly without noticing, like objects drawn to a quiet gravity. Because he didn't hesitate, and in times of rising doubt, certainty feels like leadership. It started after Naboo. The Council began to fracture in subtle ways. Some masters believed the Sith were truly extinct. Others saw Maul's death as a beginning, not an end. Jedi were being pulled into political games, and the Senate's influence over temple affairs was growing. Yoda warned patience, Mace warned preparation. And when debate stalled, it was his voice that moved the room forward. He didn't do it with arrogance. He did it with finality. When he spoke, it was as if the choice had already been made, as if the Force had whispered it to him, and he was simply passing it on. But the Force hadn't said whispered. Not always. Sometimes Mace was just deciding faster than anyone else could. Because he believed the time for waiting had passed. The galaxy was changing, slowly, yes, but changing in ways the Jedi were too cautious to name. So he named them. He questioned the Republic's stability long before others did, questioned the Council's detachment from real-world suffering, questioned the training methods that taught Jedi to feel nothing, then sent them to fight wars for people who felt everything. He didn't challenge the code, he enforced it, harder than anyone. But that enforcement came with a cost. The room grew quieter when he entered, not out of fear, out of deferral. Masters waited for his input before offering their own. Knights began quoting his judgments as precedent. Even Senate officials began asking for him directly. He had become the Order ship's anchor, and anchors don't move. He began to feel it in his bones, the stillness, the weight, the slow shift from student to leader to symbol. He still trained, still meditated, still walked the halls before dawn. But he wasn't set just a Jedi anymore. He was the one who held the others together, not with warmth, not with inspiration, with structure, with command. And the longer he stood at the center, the more he realized he wasn't set leading a council, he was holding it in place. There sets a difference between trust and faith. The council trusted Anakin Skywalker because they had to, because prophecy had placed him in their hands, because the Republic saw him as a hero, because Obi-Wan believed in him. But Mace Windu never had faith in him. From the beginning, something felt wrong. Not loud, not obvious, just off, an instability beneath the surface, a presence too loud for a boy so young. The force around Anakin didn't flow, it surged, and Mace had spent a lifetime listening for that kind of warning. He watched the boy with the same discipline he used on the battlefield, not out of cruelty, out of caution. Anakin was talented, brave, powerful, but he was also impulsive, defensive, unwilling to hear the word no without asking why not. And the Jedi were built on surrender, on patience, on detachment. Mace didn't blame Anakin for his instincts, he blamed the Council for indulging them. They had bent the code to admit him, called it a special case, said the Chosen One was above the old rules, that he was meant to bring balance. But Mace had seen what happened when exceptions were made. The line didn't break at once, it bent, quietly, until it snapped. Anakin tested those boundaries again and again. He spoke out in council, disregarded orders on missions, showed attachment, pride, fear, all the things the code warned against. And still, he was praised, promoted, given command in the war. Mace didn't object out loud, not always, but inside he was watching the arc draw itself. Not toward balance, toward something much darker. Anakin wasn't just unpredictable, he was unstable in a way that couldn't be fixed by more training, because his weakness wasn't technical, it was emotional, and emotion couldn't be removed by willpower alone. It had to be confronted, accepted, understood. But Anakin didn't want understanding, he wanted approval, he wanted power without restraint. And that was the one thing Mace would never give him. The other masters saw Mace's caution as rigid, as overly harsh. Even Obi-Wan once said quietly that Anakin needed compassion, not scrutiny. But Mace disagreed, because scrutiny was what had kept the Order alive through darker times than this. Compassion had its place, but not when the Order stood on the edge of collapse. Mace believed in standards. He believed in the code not because it was perfect, but because it was the only thing that had kept the Jedi from becoming something else. And Anakin threatened that every time he walked into the chamber like he was owed something. Mace never hated him, never feared him, but he never gave him his full trust either. Because Anakin Skywalker was a storm, and storms don't choose where they strike. They only leave wreckage. Mace Windu believed in the code, but not because he thought it made Jedi better, because it kept them from becoming worse. He had seen what happened when Jedi confused compassion for permission, when they let emotion guide judgment, when they justified small wrongs in the name of a greater right. That path never led back. It only curved downward until the Jedi couldn't see how far they'd fallen. So he built a structure around himself, around the Council, around the Order. A tower made of discipline, made of rules, made of sharp edges no one else dared touch. It wasn't built on arrogance, it was built on fear, the quiet kind. The kind that lives under silence. The kind that knows the greatest enemy isn't out there, it's inside. He watched the cracks spread through the Order like hairline fractures in glass. The younglings trained to follow, not understand. Knights sent on missions with no context. Jedi stationed as generals before they'd finished learning diplomacy. The Clone Wars hadn't started yet, but the foundation was shifting. The Jedi were being pulled closer to the Senate, closer to the battlefield, closer to power that didn't belong to them. And so Mace held tighter. Every ruling more firm. Every vote more exact. Every disagreement met with a stare that made the room fall silent. He wasn't trying to lead, he was trying to stop the unraveling. But stopping it meant standing alone. The other council members respected him, but few challenged him anymore. Not because they feared him, but because they assumed he was right. Because his judgment had been right so many times before, they stopped questioning when it would be wrong. That sets how towers rise. Not through pride, through necessity. He didn't sleep much. Didn't he eat with others? Didn't stay in chambers after meetings ended. He just trained, meditated, reviewed every decision made by the Council and the Senate, searching for the next crack before it widened. To outsiders he seemed cold, but inside he was on fire. A constant hum of pressure. The knowledge that one wrong call, one missed signal, could send the entire Order into freefall. He didn't share that burden. He didn't think anyone else could carry it, so he carried it alone. And like all towers built under tension, he didn't notice the moment it began to lean. Because from the top, everything still looked in place. The council chamber had no throne, only 12 chairs. 12 equals, but not every voice held the same gravity. By the time the Clone Wars began, the illusion of balance was already breaking. The Jedi weren't just mediators anymore, they were commanders, strategists, weapons. Each mission blurred the lines further, and each time the Order bent, Mace Windu was the one who reinforced the walls. But something had shifted. The more the galaxy looked to the Jedi for answers, the more the Council began to fracture under the pressure, not publicly, not with arguments, quietly, subtly, in glances, in hesitations, in questions that didn't make it into the archives. Mace noticed it. Yoda, once the voice of caution, had grown more withdrawn. Ki-Adi-Mundi defended the Republic blindly. Even Obi-Wan, measured as he was, had begun to show cracks of doubt in his reports. The circle was no longer united, and the only thing keeping it from collapse was Mace. Not because he demanded it, because everyone else had started looking to him to decide what came next. And he gave them answers, always. He made the hard calls, signed off on the dangerous missions, shut down disagreements before they became fractures. He held the line so well, they didn't notice they'd stopped holding it themselves. And in that silence, something crept in. Anakin. His presence in the war became larger than the Jedi themselves. The Senate adored him, the people celebrated him, even the clones followed him without question. And Mace watched as the Council began bending again. They gave him a seat, not because he was ready, but because politics demanded it. Mace objected, quietly, firmly, but the vote passed. He sat across from Skywalker in that circle and said the words, "You are on this council, but we do not grant you the rank of Master." He didn't say it to humiliate him. He said it because the Order needed to mean something. Because if they gave in now, there would be nothing left to defend. But the moment passed like a shadow across the room. Anakin's anger, the look in his eyes, the shift in the Force. It was then that Mace realized the cage he built wasn't set around the Order. It was around himself. Every rule he enforced, every boundary he drew, every silence he upheld, it wasn't set to keep others in line. It was to keep himself from unraveling. Because if he ever admitted how close they were to collapse, he might be the one to push it over. The council still sat, still spoke, still ruled, but the weight had shifted, and when something carries too much for too long, it doesn't break with sound. It breaks in silence. Mace Windu had become the center of a structure already falling, and no one noticed until the pieces began to land. Chapter 6. The Shatterpoint. Most Jedi sensed the Force as flow, as energy, as feeling. But Mace Windu didn't feel it that way. To him, the Force wasn't just motion, it was structure. He could see the points where events would turn, where people would break, where futures could be bent or shattered if touched the wrong way. They called it a gift. They were wrong. It wasn't set in sight. It was pressure, because once he saw a shatterpoint, he couldn't unsee it. He couldn't pretend the danger wasn't there. He couldn't walk away and hope the Force would fix it later. He had to act, or someone else would suffer. The first time he felt it, he was still a Padawan. A fellow initiate stood across from him in a training circle, smiling, calm, certain, but something pulled at Mace's awareness. Not a feeling, a shape, a thin fracture, invisible to everyone but him, a tension waiting to snap. He tried to end the match quickly, tried to disarm without injury, but his strike came half a second too late. The other boy overextended, fell wrong, snapped his shoulder on the floor. The healers said it was an accident. Mace knew better. He had seen it coming. That night, he didn't sleep. He stood alone in the Temple Sep's central spire, watching traffic pass through Coruscant Sep's endless sky, and asked himself one question. If you can see where things break, but you can stop them, what kind of Jedi are you? The answer shaped his path. He trained harder, focused longer, sharpened his instincts until they felt more like weapons than senses. He didn't share his visions, didn't speak of the threads he saw connecting one moment to another, not out of pride, but protection. Because if others knew how often he felt the galaxy pulling toward fracture, they might never make another decision again. So he carried it alone. During the Clone Wars, it became a compass. He could feel when a battle would turn before the first shot. He could sense when a general would make the wrong call before the strategy had even formed. He knew which Jedi would survive a siege and which would never return. He didn't always tell them, because fate, once named, starts to change. And change could make things worse. So he chose silence, precision, timing. Each decision weighed more than the last. But one day, he sensed something different. A fracture so large it ran through the center of the galaxy. So quiet it felt like the Force itself was holding its breath. It wasn't instead a battle. It wasn't instead a system. It was a person, Palpatine. The Shatterpoint wasn't set in his words or actions. It was in the way everything bent around him. All roads led to him. All conflict traced back to him. And the closer Mace looked, the louder the silence became. This wasn't set a politician. This was a fault line pretending to be a man. And Mace knew, with a clarity he had only felt once before, that if this line broke, everything else would break with it. He told the council, but he didn't say everything. He never explained how the Force whispered warnings through silence, or how his visions weren't visions at all, just inevitabilities waiting for a moment to collapse. He simply said, "The Chancellor is dangerous. He must be watched." They listened, then debated, then delayed. Mace felt the delay like a wound. Every hour, the fracture grew. Every choice made without action pulled the Republic closer to something irreversible. But he held his ground, because that was what he had been trained to do. Jedi weren't meant to fear what they saw. They were meant to control what they could, accept what they couldn't sit. And so he accepted the silence. He accepted the burden of knowing. And he tried more than anything to keep others from carrying it. What he didn't see was how that choice changed him. He thought he was becoming stronger, but he was becoming stiller, more certain, less open. He stopped questioning the Order, stopped asking if their place in the war was right, stopped wondering what it meant to lead armies while teaching peace, because questions led to fractures, and he couldn't afford more of those. He told himself he trusted Anakin, but trust with conditions isn't trust, and love without faith isn't love. Mace watched the boy with the same gaze he used for enemies, not out of hate, but out of duty. He saw the cracks in Anakin's mind long before anyone else did. The storm behind the silence, the way his fear sat beneath every word, every breath, every mission. He saw the shatter point. But he didn't see the reason behind it. He saw the weakness, not the wound. And because of that, he treated Anakin like a threat, not a soul that needed help. He told himself it was for the safety of the galaxy. And maybe it was. But there are some dangers that grow faster when feared. By the time he looked inward, the cracks were already forming inside the Council itself. Obi-Wan was questioning the war. Yoda was withdrawing deeper into meditation. The clones, once seen as allies, had become statistics in briefings. And Mace kept holding the center, kept insisting the Jedi was still what they said always been. Guardians, defenders, peacekeepers. But peace had left the galaxy years ago. And what they were guarding now was an illusion. Anakin came to him with news that should have changed everything. Palpatine wasn't just a politician. He was a Sith Lord. It was the confirmation Mace had waited for. But instead of relief, he felt emptiness. The fracture had finally exposed itself. But it was too late. Not because of Palpatine's power, not because of the Senatists' corruption, but because Mace had seen too much and understood too little. He had watched the galaxy fall like a mirror shattering in slow motion. But never once had he asked if the cracks were starting from within. He walked into Palpatine's office the way he always did, measured, ready, unshaken. But this time, he didn't walk out. Not because he was defeated, not because he was wrong, but because the truth, even when seen clearly, can still be too late to change. The battle was short, too short for what it meant. 3 masters fell before they had time to speak. Mace stood alone, blade raised, purple against red. A light forged from balance, meeting the dark made flesh. And for a moment, he had him. He disarmed the Chancellor, held the saber to his throat, spoke the words no Jedi had dared to speak in 1,000 years. He said too dangerous to be left alive. But it wasn't the darkness in Palpatine that won. It was the doubt in Anakin. Mace had known it would come down to the boy. He just didn't expect the wound to be that deep. He had seen Anakin's fear, but not how it twisted into desperation. He had felt the danger, but not how it reached into love and made it ache. Mace thought he was acting in defense, but Anakin saw judgment, saw punishment, saw loss. And when the blade came down, it wasn't the Sith who struck first, it was the shatter point. Anakin Sith's scream. Mace Sith's arm gone. The lightning, like fury unbound, thrown from the window, falling through a city that never looked up. The war didn't pause. The world didn't flinch. The man who'd held the Jedi together for decades vanished in silence. But his death wasn't set the tragedy. The tragedy was that everything he warned them about was true. The Sith had taken control. The Jedi were declared traitors, and the Order, once thousands strong, was turned to ash within a day. All of it. Seen, predicted, foretold, and still it happened. Because vision without compassion is calculation. Because knowing where things break is not the same as knowing how to hold them together. He had used his gift to find weakness, but never to understand it, never to heal it. And so the galaxy shattered around him. Palpatine remained. Anakin became Vader, and the Jedi, what was left of them, went into hiding, wondering how the end came so fast. When all the warnings were there, but the Force doesn't shout, it whispers, and Mace had listened to the cracks, but not the silence between them. That silence was where the answers were, where the truth sat. Not just about Palpatine, not just about Anakin, but about himself. The war didn't make him hard. He was already hard before it began. And when the time came to bend, he broke. The galaxy believed Mace Windu died that day, fell from the Chancellor's office like a broken weapon, gone, like so many others who stood in the way of Empire. But the Force doesn't forget its wounds, and neither did he. Some say he perished in the fall. Others say his body was never found. But the truth doesn't always live in records. Sometimes it stays in the silence left behind. If he lived, he would have watched it all collapse. The Republic, the Temple, the Padawans he trained, the masters he trusted, gone without a funeral, without a name spoken aloud. The Empire rose from the ashes of the lies he saw too late. He once thought knowledge was power, that seeing the cracks was enough to stop the wall from falling. But wisdom doesn't come from sight. It comes from surrender. And Mace Windu never surrendered. Not to his instincts, not to the Force, not even to the pain. He carried the weight of the Jedi not like a robe, but like armor welded to his soul. Even in exile, if that's where he ended, he wouldn't have shed that armor. He would have replayed it all. Palpatine Set's grin, Anakin Skywalker's cry, the fear in his own voice when the lightning struck. Not fear of death, fear of being wrong. Because in that final moment, he realized something he never said aloud. He didn't trust the Jedi anymore. He hadn't for a long time. They preached serenity. But he knew war better than any of them. They spoke of peace, but sent children into battles they never recovered from. They told him to let go, but clung to power with trembling hands. And he, who saw every fracture in the Force, stayed silent, because he thought holding them together was more important than challenging their truth. He mistook discipline for wisdom, mistook control for peace, mistook obedience for faith. And when the test came, when the Jedi needed someone to lead them away from the cliff, he led them straight over it. Not out of malice, but out of belief. A belief so rigid it could not see the storm coming. If he lived, he would have watched Luke rise, watched Yoda fade, watched Obi-Wan vanish into sand and silence. And perhaps, just once, he would have whispered their names, like prayers never answered. But he wouldn't come back, because Mace Windu didn't know how to return from failure. Not when the galaxy needed something gentler, something freer. He wasn't built to rebuild. He was built to hold the line. And once the line was gone, so was he. Whether he died in the fall or in the years after, his legacy wasn't instead a statue, wasn't instead a tale of glory. It was a warning about what happens when power loses its humility, when vision forgets compassion, when the strongest voice forgets how to listen. He was not the villain, not the hero. He was the shatterpoint no one saw coming, until the glass was already in pieces. And the Force? It moved on, quiet, endless, still whispering through the cracks he once tried to seal. Chapter 7. Master of War. He was never trained for war, not the kind with blasters and trenches, not the kind where the ground shook from gunships and the air smelled like smoke. But the robe he wore became armor anyway. The lightsaber became a command, and Mace Windu, once a seeker of balance, was handed the title of general. He accepted it without hesitation. That was the part no one ever questioned. Not him, not the clones, not even the council. As soon as the war began, titles were given like weapons, quick, cold, and without room for refusal. Mace wasn't the only Jedi to accept the rank, but he was one of the first to act like it had always been there, like it fit him. But it didn't set. Mace knew how to end conflict, but war wasn't conflict. War was something else. It wasn't about truth. It wasn't even about peace. It was a machine, moving, consuming, demanding strategy, not serenity. It asked questions the Jedi were never supposed to answer, and he answered them anyway. He led soldiers who were only weeks old. He saw them die. He saw them obey. He saw them call him sir and salute him like he was born for this, like the robe didn't matter, like the Force was just another kind of power. At first he told himself it was necessary. War wasn't a choice, it was a reaction, a defense, an unwanted duty. That's what the Council said. That's what the Senate said. That's what Master Yoda whispered in the quiet chambers between votes and missions. But every time Mace stepped onto a battlefield, something shifted inside him. He didn't enjoy it. That would have been too easy to diagnose. He didn't feel pride. That would have been a confession. But what he felt was control, and that scared him more than anything. Because control was a dangerous thing to a Jedi. It could be mistaken for peace, for discipline, for balance, but real control, total control, was a lie, and war made that lie look true. On Dantooine, he led a siege that broke the Separatist hold in one day. Jedi called it a miracle. Clones called it efficient. Mace didn't call it anything. He stood in the aftermath, staring at the wreckage like it should have meant something. But all he could think about was how many orders it took to get there, how many precise commands, how many movements, how many lives, and how good he had become at it. He didn't flinch when he gave the next command. The Council never questioned his judgment. Why would they? He never hesitated. He never asked for help. He returned from each mission with results. His record became a shield no one dared to look behind. But under that shield, cracks were forming, not in the code, not in his resolve, but in the space where a Jedi was supposed to feel the Force, where intuition used to speak louder than logic. That space was quiet now, or maybe just overrun by noise. The battlefield had its own rhythm, and Mace moved to it like a second skin, not out of anger, not even out of fear, but out of precision. That was the word that followed him. Precision, in every strike, every command, every silent judgment of a situation before others could even speak. He became the Jedi the Republic needed, the one the clones respected, the one the Council trusted, but not the one the Force spoke to. And somewhere in the silence between orders he knew it. The war didn't pause, it rotated, from one planet to the next, from one strategy to another, like a wheel that spun too fast to break, and Mace Windu kept standing in the center of it. Jabin was nothing like Dantooine. The sky there never cleared. The ground turned to mud with every drop of rain, and the rain never stopped. Soldiers drowned standing up, gunships sank on landing, Jedi slipped, clones vanished, and hope, if it ever landed there, was buried with the dead. Mace didn't ask why he was sent. He already knew. Jabim was unwinnable, but someone had to lead. Someone had to represent strength when morale was cracking, and so he went. He didn't speak like a war hero. His voice stayed calm. His posture never changed. But the way the troops looked at him, they didn't see a Jedi anymore. They saw a weapon they could follow, even in the storm. He gave commands without raising his voice. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. Even when outnumbered, even when ambushed, even when a battalion went silent for hours and the trackers showed only static, he walked through the trenches like he belonged there. He stood at the edge of collapsed tunnels like it was another meditation room. And when a clone soaked in blood and fear asked if they were going to make it out, Mace didn't set lie. He just said, "Follow the Force." But it was getting harder to hear it himself. The battlefield didn't leave room for stillness. The Force was quiet here, or maybe just too distant. Every instinct had to be sharpened by logic, every movement calculated, and that calculation didn't always leave room for mercy. There was a moment, a choice, a surrendering enemy, injured, disarmed, but the tide of the battle was turning. The troops were cornered, resources thin, no time to wait, and Mace made the call. Later he told himself it was the right decision, that it saved lives, that the delay might have cost the mission. But the clone who carried it out hesitated before pulling the trigger, and that hesitation lived in Mace's mind longer than the result. He had told himself the Jedi could fight a war without becoming warriors, but in moments like that he wasn't sure anymore. He still meditated, still repeated the code, but when he closed his eyes he saw war maps, supply lists, casualty counts, and the faces of clones who didn't live long enough to be remembered. He didn't forget their names. CT-1437, TC-88, Jumper, Harex, Von, Kree, and others whose designations were erased by the mud and the silence. He remembered each one, not as statistics, but as choices, each one a brick in the road that led him further from where he started. Some Jedi refused to lead troops. They believed it was against the Order, that it blurred the line between protector and commander. Mace didn't argue with them. He didn't have time to, but he wondered if they were right. If the Force had a voice in war, it was quieter than the orders he had to give. Victory came, eventually, but not in the way the whole news reported, not with banners or speeches, just in the form of fewer explosions, fewer deaths, fewer names on the list that night. He sat alone when it ended. No celebration, no sense of triumph, just the same silence that followed every mission, the same ache, the same thought. This is not what the Jedi were meant to be. But someone had to carry it, and he still had the strength to carry it. For now, when the mission ends, the echoes stay. Not the sounds of blasters or detonations, but the seconds right after, the ones where no one speaks, where the helmets stay on longer, where even the Force feels like it's waiting for someone else to speak first. Mace Windu spent more time in that silence than anywhere else. It followed him into the gunships, into the command briefings, into the meditation rooms that smelled more like fuel than incense. He tried to clear his mind, but the war had left fingerprints on every surface of it. He could still feel the vibration of the last explosion in his chest, still see the position markers on the battlefield even after they were gone, still hear the breath of a trooper slowing down for the last time. His armor cracked, his voice asking if he did enough. Mace told him yes, but he wasn't sure the Force agreed. Every time he returned to Coruscant, the silence changed. It wasn't the same quiet as the front lines. It was cleaner but heavier. The Jedi Temple felt untouched but not unshaken. There was still light, still tradition. but the questions whispered louder here. The council didn't show doubt, at least not openly. They spoke with order, with phrases designed to sound immovable. But Mace could see the small movements, the sideways glances, the slow breaths, the tension in the hands of masters who were not used to war. They were still trying to be Jedi in a galaxy that was asking them to be something else. He could feel the divide forming, not just between the Jedi and the Senate, but inside the Order itself, between those who adapted and those who resisted, between peacekeepers who wore robes and those who now wore armor underneath. The war blurred everything. He found himself remembering things that once guided him, the silence of the temple halls as a Padawan, the sound of the wind on his home world, the first time he felt the Force flow through him like a river that asked nothing in return. Now, the Force didn't flow, it calculated, it warned, it pushed him toward shatter points, those fragile cracks in people and events where the future could be changed. But there were too many now. So many cracks, it was hard to tell which one came first. Sometimes, late at night, he stood at the window of the council chambers and looked out over the city, not for clarity, but to remind himself that the galaxy was still turning. It was strange. He could command entire legions, face Sith Lords, negotiate peace in systems that had never known it, but it was the silence that unnerved him most. The moments between battles, the seconds before giving an order, the brief time when nothing was being done, and everything still mattered. He had started to ask questions he never allowed before. Was winning the war worth losing the meaning of being Jedi? Were they holding the Republic together, or holding it hostage to a version of peace they couldn't define anymore? And what would it mean if they won? He never asked those out loud, not even to Yoda, not to the Council, because questions like that couldn't be answered in a war room. They had to be carried, quietly, in the silence between orders, in the breath between missions, in the pause before the lightsaber activated. The Force was still with him, but it no longer told him what to do, only that something was shifting, that when it was all over, he would not return to who he was before. If there even was a version of him left to return to. They kept winning. That was the problem. Victory came so often, it stopped meaning peace. It became a strategy, a metric, a goal that moved further away every time it was reached. Mace Windu led the Jedi to win. Again and again, Dantooine, Jabiim, Harun Kal, victory in the field, but never in the soul. The Council praised him. The Senate thanked him. The troops followed him without question, but the war wasn't shaping him into something better. It was burning away what used to be there. He still spoke of peace, still meditated, still held his lightsaber with the grip of a guardian, not an executioner. But the line had blurred long ago, and he knew it. The war didn't ask the Jedi to defend. It asked them to dominate, to outthink, outfight, and outlast. And Mace did. He did it so well, they started to believe war was something the Jedi were built for. But war didn't build him. It split him. One side still believed in the code, the other knew the battlefield demanded something else, something colder. He'd mastered Varpard, a form that danced on the edge of the dark without falling in. But now he wasn't sure where that edge ended. He saw himself in the soldiers, the clones who had no choice, who didn't ask to be born in armor, who followed him into fire because he told them the Republic needed it. He respected them, mourned them, but the war didn't give time to grieve. It gave medals. And medals didn't silence the ghosts. Sometimes when the battle ended, he stayed behind, walked the ruined halls, stood where the fallen had stood, not to remember the enemy, but to remember the cost every victory had won. He began to fear what he was teaching. That strength alone could decide justice. That precision in combat was the same as moral clarity, that the Jedi were right because they were powerful enough to win. But the Force didn't choose sides, it only revealed what was. And what Mace began to see was a Jedi Order drifting from what it was meant to be. He tried to hold it together, with rules, with control, with certainty, but the more tightly he gripped it, the more fragile it became. He saw the look in Anakin's eyes, rage wrapped in loyalty, fear disguised as purpose, the kind of hunger that couldn't be trained away. Mace didn't trust him, and for that many said he was cold, harsh, distant. But Mace had seen too many turn, too many fall with conviction still in their voice. He wasn't protecting himself from Anakin. He was protecting Anakin from becoming what Mace was starting to see in himself. When the day came, when Palpatine's face was finally unmasked, when the Republic's shadow finally had a name, Mace didn't hesitate. He stood at the center of it all. Lightsaber lit, voice steady, and when the wind rushed through the broken glass of the Chancellor's office, it carried no triumph, only finality. This wasn't set at duel. It was the end of what the Jedi thought they were. And in that last moment, as lightning surged and the future shattered around him, Mace Windu realized the war had already taken what mattered most. Not his life, but his clarity. Chapter 8. The Last Decision. The room was silent, but the galaxy was screaming. He stood at the edge of everything, inside a chamber filled with glass and lightning, staring into eyes that had manipulated entire star systems. The Chancellor, the traitor, the Sith Lord they had searched for across wars, across years, across the slow collapse of the Republic. Mace Windu didn't blink, he didn't breathe, he simply moved. There was no hesitation, no pause for justice, no room for democracy or debate, because everything that had once stood for peace now stood in pieces, and this moment was the last thread before it unraveled into shadow. The Jedi had trained him to be measured, to listen to the Force, to choose balance over blood, but now the Force screamed only one thing: stop him, end this. There would be no second chance. And so the blade came down. Not with rage, not even with anger, but with certainty, with the cold understanding that some things must be done even if they should never be repeated. He wasn't executing a man. He was closing a door that should never have opened, a door that had let darkness fester beneath every Senate chair, every clone battalion, every whisper of war. Sidious was beaten. The lightsaber crackled against his, driving him lower and lower, until there was no high ground left to stand on. His face was twisted in agony, or perhaps in performance. Mace couldn't tell. Could anyone? But none of that mattered. What mattered was the window. Behind the Chancellor, a wide, clear view of Coruscant blinked in artificial peace. Speeders buzzed like insects. Towers reached for clouds. The people below had no idea that their future rested on the breath of a man holding a violet blade. And then behind him came the breath that broke the galaxy. Anakin. The boy who was never just a boy, the prophecy in robes, the chosen one, or the pawn of both sides. No one could say anymore. All Mace knew was that Anakin was too close, too emotional, too loyal to the wrong things. And Anakin was watching. Sidious spoke, of course, that voice pleading, desperate, evil wrapped in helplessness. Please, don't kill me. It was so absurd that Windu nearly sliced through the words mid-sentence. But then came Anakin's voice. Not a command, not a plea, just a question, just a fracture. He must stand trial. And that sets when Mace knew he was already losing. Because a trial meant rules. A trial meant the Senate. A trial meant the very machine that Sidious had built would now be trusted to dismantle him. And that was a trap so perfect, it almost deserved applause. No, Mace said, not to Anakin, but to history. He controls the Senate. He controls the courts. He said's too dangerous to be left alive. Anakin didn't understand. Or maybe he did, and didn't want to. To him, this was justice collapsing into execution. But to Mace it was the opposite, justice returning to its original form, raw, final, irreversible. Because peace doesn't always ask for permission. The force surged in his limbs again. It told him what needed to be done, and so he raised the blade. For the last time. Not because he wanted to, not because he enjoyed it, but because he saw something Anakin didn't, not a man, a future, and it needed to be stopped now, or it would never be stopped at all. This wasn't set personal, this wasn't set vengeance. It was the window behind Sidious, that clear, perfect glass separating two futures. In one, peace held on. In the other, darkness won. And Mace Windu was the only one left holding the line. He had lived by discipline, by duty, by the weight of every law that the Jedi believed held the galaxy together. But now he was staring at a truth too big for law, too urgent for process, and the blade in his hand wasn't justice. It was mercy for a galaxy that didn't yet know how close it was to losing itself. He moved again. But this time the blade didn't set land. The scream came before the fall. It wasn't Sidious who cried out. It wasn't Windu. It was Anakin. Not loud in sound, but in action, in betrayal, in the shattering of trust between master and apprentice, Jedi and Jedi, future and past. He moved faster than thought, cutting through the tension with a single blow, not at Sidious, at Mace. The blue blade came from behind and tore through everything Mace believed could still be salvaged. His arm fell, his grip loosened, the window, the future, vanished in a flash of lightning, and Sidious, once cornered, rose with a fury that had waited decades to be free. It was over in seconds. The dark side didn't gloat, it screamed. Sidious' power surged like a dam breaking, throwing Windu through the very glass he had been staring past, out into the endless sky of Coruscant. But the fall wasn't just the worst part. The worst part was that Mace had seen it coming. Not in vision, not in prophecy, but in feeling, in silence. In those long moments during the war, when he had looked at Anakin Skywalker and seen the storm building, not outside, but within. He had known the boy was powerful, too powerful, chosen perhaps. But chosen by whom? The Council never trusted him fully, neither did Mace, not out of arrogance, but out of memory, because the galaxy had seen this before, power gifted too soon. Hearts torn too young, warriors forged too fast. The Jedi knew what came from rushing fate, and yet they did it anyway. There was a time Mace tried to believe in Anakin, not openly, not with kind words or soft eyes, but in his own way. He watched, he judged, he waited, and when the war demanded more from all of them, he let Anakin rise, mission by mission, responsibility by responsibility, hoping that trust would grow like roots in soil. But soil soaked in blood doesn't grow anything clean. And still, he wanted to believe. Even as he stood in the Chancellor's office, blade raised, he left space for Anakin to understand, to choose the Jedi, to choose truth. But the boy didn't. He chose fear. Fear of loss, fear of letting go, fear that without Sidious, something more precious would die. And Mace realized too late that fear had already won. He remembered the conversation in the council chamber, Anakin demanding to be made a master, the flare of emotion, the feeling that he wasn't being honored but restrained, that the Jedi were hiding something from him, that power was being stolen instead of earned. That was the moment, that was the fracture. And fractures don't heal in war, they widen. Now lying broken, falling through the sky, Mace wasn't angry, he wasn't surprised, he wasn't even afraid, he was empty. Because the choice he had made, to kill Sidious, hadn't been just a tactical decision. It had been the last act of belief, that someone, anyone, would see the truth in time, that justice, even if it was hard, would be understood by the one person who needed to understand it most. But Anakin never heard that silence. He only heard promises. And Sidious had been whispering promises for years. That was the truth no Jedi wanted to face. The Sith didn't steal the galaxy. They waited, they promised, they offered what the Jedi refused to speak aloud: control, certainty, power that came without the weight of humility. Anakin didn't betray the Jedi because he hated them. He betrayed them because they never gave him what he needed, and Sidious did. As the wind howled past and the city lights blurred into streams below, Mace felt the failure settle deeper than the wounds on his body. It wasn't just that the Jedi were gone, it was that they had never figured out how to adapt, to reach, to see the next war before it began. They had rules, the Sith had answers. And sometimes, answers win. He had promised himself, in the quiet years, that he would never cross the line. That power used in fear was the path to darkness, but in the end, he stepped across it. Not because he fell, but because he thought he could stop someone else from falling. Now the blade was gone, the hand was gone, the window was shattered, and the future had chosen its path. Mace Windu didn't scream. He closed his eyes, because the promise he had made to stop this future was already broken. The silence after the fall was heavier than the crash. Inside the Chancellor's office, the air still crackled with the ghost of lightning. The scent of scorched flesh lingered. But neither Anakin nor Sidious moved at first. They stood in the hollow echo of their choices, one too stunned to breathe, the other too satisfied to speak. Anakin's hand trembled, not from battle, but from the weight of what he had just done. The blue of his lightsaber still glowed, casting faint light against the polished floor. His blade had cut down a Jedi Master. His loyalty had shifted in a breath. And the galaxy, though it hadn't noticed yet, had changed forever. Sidious turned to him slowly. His face was marked by feigned weakness, but his eyes burned with something far older, something alive, something that had waited, and now it was awake. "You did well," he said. But Anakin didn't answer, because it wasn't victory he felt. It was silence, the kind that crawls under your skin when the moment you thought would save someone doesn't. He had believed Sidious would end the war, that Padme would live, that this act, this betrayal was the price of peace. But there was no peace in this room, only shadows. Mace Windu had been many things: harsh, unforgiving, controlled, but Anakin had known in the part of himself that still remembered being a boy on Tatooine, that Windu was not cruel. He had been a wall, a line drawn in stone, one that could not bend, and now that line was broken. Not by Sidious, but by him. Anakin wanted to justify it, to believe that Windu had gone too far, that the Jedi had lost their way. That killing Sidious would have been murder, not justice, that he was right to stop it. But right doesn't shake like this. Right doesn't come with regret before the body hits the street. And Sidious smiled. Not wide, not theatrical, just enough to let Anakin know the trap hadn't closed in that moment. It had closed long ago, when the war began, when the secrets were planted, when fear became a habit and the Jedi became tools. "You now understand," Sidious said, voice low. "The Jedi are traitors. They would have destroyed the Republic to protect their power. You saved it." The words were designed to comfort, but they pressed down like chains. Because Anakin hadn't saved anything. Not really. He had traded one lie for another. He looked at his hand, the same hand that had once held Ahsoka when she was just a child. The same hand that had lifted Obi-Wan from the flames of Geonosis. The same hand that had reached for his mother's grave. That hand had now ended Mace Windu Sip's life. And Sidious watched it all. Every flicker of emotion, every crack in the armor. He didn't rush, he didn't command. He simply stood beside Anakin, letting the weight of choice do the work. Letting the guilt harden into obedience. Letting the boy vanish beneath the man. And when Anakin finally spoke, it wasn't in defiance, it was in surrender. "What happens now?" he asked. Sidious didn't blink. "Now, You become what you were meant to be. And there it was, the final twist, not a command, a prophecy. The Jedi had always talked about destiny as something to avoid, to question, to outgrow, but Sidious offered it like gravity, inevitable, pulling, final. Anakin didn't walk toward the dark side. He sank, one step at a time, not with rage, but with exhaustion, because hope had always asked him to sacrifice, but now, for the first time, someone was offering power instead. He didn't trust Sidious, but he no longer trusted himself. The line between saving someone and controlling them had blurred long ago, and Anakin had crossed it, first with Padme, then with the Council, now with Windu. Every choice he made to protect had cost more than it saved. And maybe that was the lesson. Maybe that sets what the Sith had always known. That people don't break because they are angry. They break because they're tired of not being heard. And in that office, in that silence, Sidious finally spoke what Anakin had longed to hear. "You are not a weapon," he said. "You are the future." But the words came too late. Because Mace Windu was gone. And what stood in his place was not a future. It was a wound. The body had barely cooled when the purge began. Sidious didn't wait. The plan that had taken decades to design was set into motion with a single word: execute Order 66. It didn't sound like the end of an era. It didn't even sound angry. It was clinical, efficient, quiet, the kind of command you give when everything is already decided. And across the stars, Jedi began to fall. Not in battle, not in honor, but in betrayal, in confusion. Some were shot in the back, some died protecting younglings, some never even drew their sabers. They were wiped away like ash from a table, not because they failed, but because their presence was inconvenient now. Anakin watched the galaxy burn and told himself it had to be done. He repeated it like a mantra. The Jedi were traitors. They would have destroyed the Republic. This is for peace. This is for Padme. But his hands, the same hands that had shaken on Geonosis, that had built a podracer as a child, that had held his dying mother, they were steady now, too steady. Not because they were sure, but because they were empty. When he led the 501st into the Jedi Temple, the silence was thicker than fear. The clones followed without question. They didn't ask why a Jedi Knight was slaughtering his own. They just marched, they just fired, they just obeyed. Because the clones were trained for loyalty. And Anakin had run out of reasons to disobey. Inside the temple, he felt ghosts. The training rooms where he had once sparred with Obi-Wan. The high windows that let in Coruscant's midday light. The archive hall where Yoda had nodded in approval once when Anakin asked too many questions. It was all still there. And none of it mattered. Because this wasn't the temple anymore, it was a target. And the younglings weren't students, they were threats. That sets what he told himself, anyway. The truth, the unbearable truth, is that he knew they were just children. He remembered being one of them. He remembered the fear, the hope, the wide-eyed belief that the Jedi were heroes. He remembered thinking that lightsabers meant protection. And now, he was the one they were hiding from. Some ran, some tried to fight. Most didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. And Anakin kept walking. Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't stop. Because if he stopped, if he hesitated even for a second, he would see what he had become. He would hear his mother's voice. He would feel Padme's heartbeat. He would remember Obi-Wan's patience. And he would fall apart. So he kept going, room by room, silence by silence, until the temple was nothing but smoke. And somewhere deep in the Senate building, Sidious felt the moment the last of the resistance faded, not because he sensed death, but because he sensed deathsence. The Jedi, the order that had balanced the galaxy for 1,000 generations, were gone. and no one was left to stop him. No one except a boy who had believed too hard, loved too much, and broken too quietly. Anakin Skywalker was still there, somewhere under the armor, but he had no voice left, no shape, no path, only orders, only nightmares, only Sidious. The Jedi fell in fire. The Republic fell in applause. And the last thing Anakin heard before the world fell silent was the sound of Sidious laughing. Not loud, not cruel, just pleased. Because everything had gone exactly as planned. And the boy who might have saved the galaxy had just handed it over, piece by piece, lie by lie, cut by cut. Mace Windu was gone. Obi-Wan was in hiding. Yoda had vanished into exile. And Anakin, the chosen one, had no one left to follow. So he followed the only voice still speaking. And that voice called him Vader. Not because it fit, but because it erased everything else. Chapter 9, Falling Without Sound. He didn't scream. That's what haunted Anakin later, not the lightning, not the blade, not even the fall. It was the silence. The moment Mace Windu was thrown from that high-rise window, he didn't cry out, he didn't beg, he didn't curse, he let go. The galaxy watched the Jedi lose, but Mace didn't lose in that moment. He accepted something, not defeat, something colder. The Force had shown him every fracture in the Republic, every crack in Anakin, every moment that would lead to ruin, but it never showed him this. He had always trusted his own control, his control over the Force, over battle, over himself. But no one controls gravity. No one controls time, once it's slipping past the glass. As he fell, the city lights stretched above him like stars he'd never touch again. This was the man who had stood in the heart of war and never blinked, who held his lightsaber like it was judgment itself, who saw the shatterpoints in others but ignored the one inside himself. He didn't fall because he was defeated. He fell because everything had already collapsed before he hit the window. Palpatine's voice still echoed above him. Anakin's blade still burned in the air, but Mace was beyond that now. The fall wasn't measured in meters, it was measured in memory. His last thought before the pain was not of the Jedi Order, not of the war, not of victory. It was of what he had failed to do. He had thought ending Palpatine would save the galaxy, but there was no version of this story where Anakin stayed whole. The boy had already chosen, Mace just hadn't seen it yet. As his body hurtled downward, wind crashing against him like waves, he didn't reach for the Force, not to stop himself, not to fight fate. He'd used the Force his entire life to stand still while everything else moved. This time, he let it carry him. Somewhere above, glass still floated in the air like frozen time. Somewhere above, the man who had once been chosen stood in silence, staring at his hands. And below, only shadow. Coruscant was not a city, it was a canyon made of light and secrets. There were levels below levels, whole worlds where sunlight never reached. As Mace fell, those levels opened to receive him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't land as a Jedi. He landed as a man. Broken, bleeding, forgotten. There was no crowd to witness, no monument, no heroic end. The galaxy would record this as the moment Mace Windu died, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was stranger. He survived, not in glory, not in defiance, he survived in silence. The kind of silence that wraps around bones, the kind that doesn't ask for answers because there are none. His body was crushed, bones shattered, nerves severed, his lightsaber was gone. His name would soon be spoken only in past tense, but his mind was still burning. Because Mace Windu did not believe in surrender. And even lying beneath the city, in a place without sky or sound, he knew something had not ended, something had just begun. Not a war, not a rebellion, something darker. something he had sensed every time Anakin walked into the council chamber. And he wasn't start falling anymore. He was waiting. The surface of Coruscant was made of lights and lies, but below it, far below it, was something else. The Jedi called it the Undercity. The Senate ignored it. The wealthy denied it even existed. But for Mace Windu, it became the only place where he was no longer hunted by truth or memory or prophecy. He awoke in darkness, not hours later, days, maybe more. Pain was his first companion. It didn't speak, but it reminded him that he still existed. Every breath was a negotiation. Every twitch of a muscle came with a question: did he still want to live? He had been trained to sense life, but here life was not bright. It was hidden, shadowed, the kind of life that survives by pretending it isn't there. He wasn't rescued, he wasn't discovered, he was scavenged. A street surgeon found him, not out of compassion, out of curiosity. A body with one arm burned to the bone, a body that somehow still pulsed with life, even though the heart should have stopped. Mace never gave his name. He didn't need to. The man didn't ask. They fixed what they could. Ripped robes became wrappings. Stolen bacta became a prayer whispered over cracked ribs, but some things couldn't be fixed. His right arm was gone, not just severed. It had been burned out of existence. Lightning had torn through the nerves, the bone, the force itself. He could still feel it in his dreams, but not in his reach. The rest of his body was quieter, broken but silent. He didn't speak for weeks. Not because he couldn't set, because there was no one left to hear him. The city above moved on. The Jedi Temple smoked for days, then fell. The Senate crowned an emperor, and the Holonets played the same line over and over. Mace Windu is dead. Below, no one cared. Down here, people didn't ask who you were. They asked what you were running from. And Mace wasn't sure anymore. The Jedi, the Sith, himself? He walked again, eventually, slowly, like someone trying to remember what it meant to be real. He kept his face in shadows, wrapped what remained of his robes around his shoulders like a mask. And every night, he sat against a wall and listened to footsteps, to whispers, to the war that was still happening, just with different names now. No lightsabers, just blasters and betrayals. He didn't speak, but he watched. Watched the Empire grow without resistance. Watched stormtroopers replace senators. Watched the symbol of peace become a symbol of control. Sometimes he closed his eyes and tried to feel the Force again, but it was harder now. Louder, distant, like trying to hear someone scream through durasteel. He had once said the Force was balance, but balance didn't live here. What lived here was something else. A quiet truth that the Jedi had lost long before he fell. He had sensed it in the Clone Wars, seen it in the Council, felt it in Anakin, but he hadn't spoken it. Not truly, not loudly enough to matter. And now, all he had left were hours, endless hours, to sit in the dark and remember the things he should have done. And wait for the moment the Empire would come looking for ghosts. He didn't go by Mace Windu anymore. That name was a target, a relic, a sentence. But even in silence, even buried beneath layers of dust and fear, the name refused to die. It moved through the underworld in pieces, like whispers between cracks. A soldier with one arm, a Jedi with no saber, a man with eyes that didn't blink when the blaster pointed his way. The people down here didn't call him a Jedi. They didn't know what the Jedi were anymore. The war had erased that word. All they knew was that something old still walked among them, something that didn't sleep, didn't beg, didn't belong. He became legend before he became real again. Children said he was a ghost who stole food from stormtroopers and left it for starving families. Smugglers said he moved faster than credits, disappearing before deals could go bad. Street priests swore he watched them from alleyways, never speaking, always judging. And the Empire didn't say his name at all. Officially, Windu had died, thrown from a tower, burned by lightning, lost to gravity. Another casualty in a Jedi coup. That was the story. Clean, finished. But deep in the lower levels, where facts had to earn their breath, stories were different. A senator's aide once claimed she saw a man fitting his description, tattered cloak, left-handed, silent, break into an Imperial food convoy and leave without taking anything but a datapad. 2 days later, the names of 3 missing Padawans surfaced on a black market server. Rescued, hidden, moved off-world. No one could prove it, but those who believed didn't need proof. Mace didn't seek revenge. He didn't gather allies. He didn't plan rebellion. He wasn't a shadow of hope. He was something else. A wound that didn't set close. He wandered, sometimes above level 1300, sometimes below, never in the same place, never near light. The Empire had hunters, inquisitors, bounty droids, informants, but they didn't waste time on dead men. And yet, some were still afraid. One Imperial officer once suggested tracking him, just in case, a backup protocol, a failsafe. The idea never left the room. The man didn't return to work. Fear works best when the myth is louder than the evidence. But Mace was not afraid. He was tired. Tired of watching people surrender to power because power wore the right uniform. Tired of silence being mistaken for peace. Tired of the Force choosing to remain quiet while children were stolen and trained to forget their names. He wasn't waiting for the rebellion. He wasn't part of any future plan. He didn't believe in the prophecy anymore. What he believed in was silence. He had spoken for decades, advised chancellors, led clones, judged Sith, trained students. None of it had saved anything. So now he said nothing. Let the galaxy forget. Let the myth rot. Let the Jedi become a story people stop telling their children. But every now and then, when the darkness stretched too far, when the Empire's boot pressed a little harder on the throat of the innocent, someone would leave a mark. A symbol scratched into Duracrete, a handprint in violet, a sigil no trooper could decode. It didn't matter if it was him or not. The fear was real. Because even the Empire couldn't kill every ghost. And there were still a few places left in the galaxy where people dared to say the name. Not loudly, not often, but enough. Mace Windu, the Jedi who didn't set fall. He disappeared. But he didn't die. Not yet. He never went back to the temple. Even when the streets above grew quiet. Even when the rumors of rebellion reached the cracks beneath Coruscant. Even when whispers said a farm boy had destroyed the Death Star and the Force had started to breathe again. He stayed in the dark. Because he remembered what it felt like to burn. Not with heat, with failure. He had stood at the center of the galaxy and tried to hold it together. He had sensed the cracks before they showed. He had warned of Sidious. He had moved first. He had acted with clarity. And still, he lost. Anakin turned. The Jedi fell. The war ended in silence, and the Empire rose without apology. What was left for him to do? He no longer believed in orders, or councils, or destinies. He only believed in watching. From the edge of ruined rooftops, from the corners of smoke-filled bars, from broken tunnels that echoed with boots but never names, he watched what the galaxy became when no one stopped it. He saw Force-sensitive children sold to collectors. He saw clones abandoned in alleys, coughing from lungs the Kaminoans never finished properly. He saw Inquisitors hunt with rage but sleep with fear. And above it all, he saw the Empire celebrate its own silence. The people didn't cheer anymore. They obeyed, quietly, quickly, like children trained not to speak in the presence of anger. He had once believed the Force was balance. Now he understood it was memory. It didn't intervene. It didn't protect. It simply remembered, who had fallen, who had watched, who had tried. He was no longer a blade. He was a scar, and he carried it without ceremony. When word came that Palpatine had died, really died, he didn't move. When the second Death Star fell, he stayed where he was. He didn't cheer, he didn't streep, he just listened. And for the first time in years, the streets made a sound he hadn't heard since the war ended. Children laughing. Not because someone gave them rations, not because a stormtrooper looked away, but because something had changed. The air didn't feel heavy. The shadows didn't feel watched. And in that moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe the fire had passed. But he didn't leave the underworld. Not yet. The galaxy had a way of healing on the surface while rotting underneath, and someone had to stay behind and remember. Someone had to watch the cracks in case they came back. He didn't set claim to be right. He didn't want redemption. He didn't want a statue or a name in the archives. He just wanted to stay where the silence began. To be the last Jedi the Empire never found. To be the one who didn't fall, just faded slowly into the quiet. And if the Force ever chose to speak again, it would know where to find him. Waiting, watching, remembering the fire. Chapter 10. The Jedi Who Should Have Been. There were Jedi who laughed when peace returned, who meditated beneath waterfalls, who trained younglings with a calm voice and a kind heart. Mace Windu was not one of them. He didn't smile when the war ended. He didn't sit beneath trees or speak in riddles. His silence was not the silence of wisdom. It was the silence of weight, of someone who had seen the line blur between peace and war, and realized too late that no one else saw it at all. From the earliest days of his training, the other Padawans knew he was different. They used to whisper that the Force didn't speak to him. It warned him, it showed him danger, not destiny. While others reached for the light, Mace learned how to stand in its shadow and not flinch. He wasn't born into calm, he had to carve it out of himself. The Temple Masters saw it. They watched how he walked, rigid but balanced, like a soldier with a sword in his back. He never broke form, never let his emotions speak louder than his breath. But when he looked at someone, it felt like he already knew how they'd die. That was the weight he carried, even before the war. Mace Windu never wanted to lead, but the Jedi Order did not ask. It assigned. The war gave him rank but not rest. The title of Master did not change him. It only pushed him further from the boy he once was, the boy who questioned the Jedi Code in silence, then punished himself for it in private. No one ever saw that version of him again. He stood beside Yoda, but never behind him, and even though the galaxy thought they shared the same convictions, they didn't. Yoda believed in hope. Mace believed in control. Control over fear, over the dark, over himself. That was the difference, and it was a heavy one. He led battalions into planets no one could pronounce, stood on craters where entire cities used to be, and every time he returned, fewer Jedi walked beside him. He didn't cry, he didn't grieve, but he counted, every single one. And when they asked him if the war was just, he didn't answer, because he didn't know anymore. Victory never felt like victory to him. It felt like loss, paused, like something was waiting just beyond the next star system. Something they couldn't name, but he could feel it, that quiet before a storm that never ended. He tried to speak of it once. He told the council he sensed something unnatural surrounding Chancellor Palpatine. Not a threat, not yet, but something wrong, and they told him to observe, to wait, to trust the Force. But Mace didn't trust the Force. He trusted Patton, and every instinct he had told him that peace was being used like a mask. He had killed Sith before. He knew how the dark hid itself. He knew it didn't always come with a red blade and yellow eyes. Sometimes it came with applause, with promises, with laws passed in emergency sessions. He saw it, but no one else was willing to admit it. And so the burden stayed with him. They said Mace was too rigid, too strict, too willing to make hard choices without emotion. But that wasn't the truth. He felt everything. He just buried it deeper than most. Not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid of what might happen if he let it out. The boy who once felt anger burn through his hands never let himself feel again. That was the price. The galaxy remembers Jedi who smiled when they won, who raised their lightsabers to cheers, who gave speeches about peace. Mace Windu did not give speeches, he gave warnings, and when those warnings were ignored, he gave silence. Because he knew the truth. Some victories are just quieter forms of defeat, and some Jedi don't return from war, even if they're still breathing. He wore the robes, held the rank, sat in the council chamber. But the real Mace Windu, he had already begun to vanish. There was a moment, just one, where Mace Windu hesitated, not during battle, not on a battlefield or in a council meeting, but in meditation. He sat alone, legs crossed, spine unbent, as always. But something different happened that day. The Force didn't come, or maybe it did, just not the way it used to. He reached for the stillness, and found only noise. Doubt. It crept in not as fear, but as a question, one he couldn't push away. What if we were wrong? Not about the war, not even about the Chancellor. About the Jedi. He had spent years shaping his own form of balance, the Vapad, a lightsaber technique that walked the edge of darkness, not to embrace it, but to master it, control it, channel it. Others feared it, some even called it dangerous. But Mace didn't set, because it was honest. Vapad didn't pretend the dark side was a myth. It didn't hide from aggression. It took the storm inside, the lightning, the fire, the raw surge of conflict, and turned it into precision, into discipline. But he wondered if in doing that he had let part of the dark live within him, not as corruption, but as compromise. Because the line between discipline and denial is thin, and sometimes when he fought, he didn't feel clarity. He felt power, controlled, yes, but undeniable. He thought he could hold it forever, that as long as he never gave in, he had already won. But the Force didn't seem so sure anymore. The Council once asked him how he could use a style so close to the dark and remain unshaken. He answered them with silence, because the truth was, he wasn't unshaken. He had simply learned how to move while broken. He trusted no one else with the burden. Not Yoda, not Kenobi, not even himself in his weaker moments. Because he knew if he ever let go of control, even for a second, the damage would be permanent. He had built a life of certainty, but inside, everything trembled. Mace knew something was wrong with the Order, not corrupted but blind, too devoted to tradition, too slow to react, too willing to believe that peace was proof of success, rather than just the calm before the collapse. He tried to warn them about the Senate, about Sidious, about how they were being pulled into politics, into roles they were never meant to hold. But the Council was not built to listen, it was built to agree. So he changed, quietly. He stopped trying to fix the Order and focused on stopping what came next. That's what Vapad had always been, a way to take what couldn't be avoided and turn it into something that couldn't be controlled. He watched the clones march with perfect obedience. He watched senators cheer as emergency powers grew without limit. He watched the Jedi doubt themselves, one by one, as the war blurred the meaning of victory. And every night he returned to his chamber, tried to meditate, and felt the same thing. The Force, hesitant, almost like it was waiting for him to admit something. But he wouldn't set. He couldn't set. Because if he admitted that doubt had grown inside him, he might never find a way to hold the line again. The blade he carried was purple, not by vanity, not by style, but because it stood between red and blue, between chaos and order. between light and dark. He chose that place because someone had to. Mace Windu did not believe in prophecy. He believed in pattern, in consequence, and he saw where this all was going. He just didn't know how much of it he had already helped build. And maybe that's what the Force was really trying to show him. That you can fight darkness your entire life and still cast your own shadow without meaning to. He tightened his grip, not on his lightsaber, on himself. Because if he loosened it, if he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had seen, what he had done, what was coming, he would fall. And Mace Windu had made peace with many things, but he would not fall. The records don't tell the truth. They mention Windu's victories, his role on the council, his skill with the blade, but they don't speak of what he feared or what he knew. They don't say how many times he tried to resign, not in words but in silence, choosing missions far from Coruscant, volunteering for fronts others avoided, hoping quietly that the war would claim him before the truth did. The truth that the Jedi were fading, not in numbers but in meaning. He saw it before the rest, that the Order had become a symbol, not of peace but of power, not guardians of balance, but participants in a war that was never theirs to begin with. The archives never recorded his meetings with Yoda behind closed doors, the long silences, the uneasy pauses, the way even Yoda, with all his wisdom, had no answer for what was unfolding. They don't include the time Mace suggested they stop fighting for the Republic, that maybe neutrality wasn't weakness, maybe it was clarity, that serving the Force and serving a government were no longer the same path. Yoda didn't disagree. But he didn't agree either, because to stand still in war is to be trampled, and to withdraw is to be accused of betrayal. So, they stayed, and Mace stayed with them. But something in him shifted that day. He stopped thinking of himself as a Jedi Master. He became something else, a wall, a barrier between collapse and survival. He would hold the position, even if it cost him everything. He wasn't just defending the Jedi. He was trying to give them time. Time to remember who they were before the galaxy told them what to become. The archives mention his confrontation with Boba Fett's father Jango, but not the way Mace looked into the boy's eyes after, not the way his fingers hesitated over his saber hilt, not the way he wanted to say something, anything, but couldn't, because the war needed him to be efficient, not kind. The archives say he led operations during the Clone Wars, but not that he started leaving hollow recordings behind, messages with no clear recipient, words meant for a future that might never come. He would sit alone and speak to nothing. "I'm not sure if we're still right," he once said, to the empty room. If we ever were. The archives are clean, sanitized. They tell the story of a man who served without question, who gave his life defending the galaxy. But they don't mention how often he wondered if the galaxy deserved defending anymore. Not out of bitterness, but sorrow. He didn't hate the Republic. He mourned it. He watched it become something else, a stage for manipulation, a mirror reflecting only what the Senate wanted to see. And the Jedi stood beside that mirror, holding it up. He thought about walking away, taking a starfighter and vanishing, becoming a myth like the ones he'd read about as a youngling. But he stayed, not for the Republic, not even for the Order. He stayed for the moment he feared would come, when someone would need to make a choice no one else was willing to. And when it came, it would be fast. It wouldn't allow for debate, or votes, or reflection. It would demand action, and he would be ready. The archives don't say this, but Mace Windu knew he wasn't the hero of the story. He wasn't chosen, he wasn't beloved, he wasn't easy to follow. He was the blade that cut the path forward when no other way existed. Sharp, necessary, and destined to break. He stood before Sidious with eyes that didn't flinch, not because he was fearless, but because he had nothing left to fear. He had already seen the fall. He didn't need a vision. The rot wasn't coming, it was already here. It wore the face of law, it spoke through the Senate's voice, and it had convinced the Jedi to sit quietly while it took root. So Mace didn't wait. He moved faster than the prophecy ever imagined. Not because he thought he could kill Sidious, but because there was no longer time to do anything else. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to stop what couldn't be undone. And he almost did. The lightsaber met its target. The force surged through his limbs like a final breath held too long. He felt the darkness crack. For a second it almost gave way. But then the boy stepped forward. Not with certainty, not with darkness in his eyes, just confusion, pain, loyalty tangled in the wrong place. And that was enough. Mace didn't scream when the lightning struck. He didn't plead. He didn't even blink. He understood. That moment had been waiting for him since the day he joined the Order, since the day he started seeing things too clearly, since the day he stopped pretending peace could be maintained by ignoring the storm. He fell, but he didn't vanish. Not truly. Some believe he died, others whisper of survival, of exile, of a broken Jedi wandering the edges of the galaxy. But those are distractions. What mattered was that he was willing. He was willing to be the one the others feared becoming. The Jedi who made choices without permission. The one who saw darkness rising and didn't ask the Council to agree before acting. The Jedi who knew the cost and paid it anyway. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, pushed too hard, trusted too little, misjudged too many. But he never turned away. He never stopped trying to hold the line. Not for himself. Not even for the Order. But for the ones who would come after. For the children who might grow up in a galaxy that remembered balance not as a myth, but as a promise once made by those who stood in the fire and didn't move. Anakin would fall. Sidious would rise. The temple would burn. But somewhere buried in the silence of what came after, the story of Mace Windu would remain. Not in textbooks, not in statues, but in the feeling that there was once a Jedi who didn't smile easily, who didn't speak often, but who stood like stone when everything else crumbled. He wasn't the chosen one. He wasn't the teacher. He wasn't the myth. He was the warning. The quiet voice in the Force that said, if you do nothing, this is what follows. And maybe, one day someone would hear it. Maybe not in this age, but in the next one, where Jedi would rise again, where they'd walk the line between light and dark with more caution, more humility, and more truth. Not because they were wiser, but because once, a man with purple light in his hands chose to stand, knowing it wouldn't be enough. But standing anyway. Mace Windu didn't fail. He fulfilled a role the galaxy never thanked him for, and never will. Because some Jedi are not meant to be remembered in peace. They are meant to be remembered in the moment before peace is lost.